How did you take the weekend? I know your lovely wife was there. Like, how was that for all of you, for both of
I
you?
had a great time. It was great. I wanted to get up on stage, but we ran out of time. But played
Mm.
some spades, had a good book talk. So yeah, it was great.
Yeah, the book talk was amazing. And I actually, that's one of the places I wanted to launch because in addition to your book talk, we got to spend time with Dr. Daniel Black. We had Corey, and now I'm forgetting his last name, but a member of the Gullah Geechee community who was there to talk about the sweetgrass and the weaving and the history behind it. It was absolutely phenomenal. Where we were at was absolutely phenomenal. And in an uncomfortable sort of way, I wanted to sort of raise this for you because we were on a plantation. It was absolutely gorgeous. It was right there on the beach, but it was a plantation. And so being able to have the ritual where we're honoring the ancestors, I thought was just so perfect. And this sort of duality of being in a space where, as I think it was either yourself or Corey, I can't remember which one, or maybe it was Dr. Sunman Show, but talks about the fact that you couldn't imagine having a resort at a concentration camp, right? You can't imagine having the Buchenwald resort because if it's at a concentration camp, we don't necessarily conflate that sort of beauty and that sort of horror in a way that allows people to vacation happily. But this was one of those places that was a plantation, a concentration camp, if you will, that has since been turned into this space. And there was something about reclaiming that history and reclaiming the right to be in that space. And I don't know, I don't know if you participated in the ritual. And I was very much in my own space. So I don't know who all was there, but being able to sort of reclaim our rightful space in that time was absolutely magical for me. How did you come to that moment?
It felt really good. So for transparency, like I live on a plantation. I live on a
Mm,
200-year-old plantation. That's where we're talking from. That's where I'm recording from. And you're right, like the idea of reclaiming those spaces because I am in going through the process of petitioning the National Historic Registry to change the name because it's named after the people who enslaved the people here.
mm,
And they didn't build that plantation, right? They didn't build that I call them prison labor camps. They didn't build those labor camps. And so we reclaiming it is important because we talk about how we built this country
mm.
and the individual spaces in this country we also built. Those places would not exist except for the labor and intellectual properties of Black people. I remember once a few years ago, I was hired to write a piece about the plantation tourism in Charleston.
Mm.
And during the tour, I went, visited a few plantations. And during the tour, one of the tourists asked, it was just like kind of how we were this weekend. There was a storm that had just come through, right?
Yeah.
And one of the tourists asked, well, how did this place survive the storm? And the tour guide explained that, oh, the levees and the dams that they built to grow the rice still
Mm.
work. They built them 400 years ago in the 1600s, and they still work. And so we think of them, of the people who built those places through their labor and not through their intellectual property. They went and specifically got the engineers and the horticultural experts to grow that rice because we call them planters, but they didn't know how to plant stuff,
They didn't know how to
right?
plant anything.
We
Right. They
we
just
show
planted, they
them
knew how
how
to
to
plant
do it.
themselves in other people's land, but that's the only planting they actually knew how to do was taking somebody else's stuff.
Right. So I think it is important that we reclaim these spaces because we built them, our intellectual property, our labor, and we contributed to the economy of this country. So
Mm.
I think it was important to reclaim those kinds of spaces.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've learned from reading and following your threads, I feel like there should be a category for master Twitter thread, or I don't know what we would call it, but we could call it the Michael Harriot Award. But I feel like there's also a form of reclamation that we as people of African heritage have to also claim in terms of our mental space. You had a thread recently where you presented as initially someone who did very bad in school. You talked about behavior problems that you had, I was like, I never thought Michael Harriot. I was imagined you as a good student, and you sort of approach this idea of you being a bad student through the veil of how schools traditionally look at Black children who come to them. Thoughtful, ready to have intellectual conversation and discourse, and not who have just sort of been sort of beaten into submission the way so many of us were, and that you I think credit a lot to being homeschooled, but the idea of reclaiming our mental space and the idea of reclaiming our ability to not think in forms that center whiteness. You may recall one of the conversations we had at the event. We noted multiple times throughout the conversation, we all here together, but we still talking about white people. Like, we're not talking about, like, we have not yet taken the reclamation of the physical space that we had experienced the night before, had not done that same work to the same degree in our mental space, because even when they weren't there, we were still talking about them. And in this thread where you talk about the way that you were homeschooled, and then you got all the zeros you got for not turning in assignments, and the fact that you didn't understand why if you got the math problem correct, why you was getting points taken off, or not showing the work and not conforming to the performance that is often required of us. And it felt to me in that moment we were having the conversation at one of the talks where Dr. Sun Michaud and I were talking with Karen, that there was also a practice of not just physically reclaiming a space, but also reclaiming our mental space. And I feel like that's something that your writing helps a lot of people to do. What say you about that dynamic? It feels very easy to have a land acknowledgement and to claim that, physically we are on land that is ours, but reclaiming one's mental freedom, that to me is a different exercise. And it's not one that I think we necessarily take on with as much gusto. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it is important. I think, when we gather in spaces in community, I think we often do it. But one of the things that we do, and I think is problematic, is when the subject turns to Blackness, Blackness is always and often juxtaposed against whiteness, right? And we know that, white people invented Black people. But when we're in community, when we're amongst the people who share our culture and our background and our heritage, right? Like, it is important for our mental space to not kind of judge ourselves, to juxtapose what we are against the backdrop, against the measuring rod of whiteness, because it is nothing to aspire to. And we existed, and much of who we are existed before the concept of Blackness or whiteness ever existed, right?
That's
And
right.
so when we talk about like I remember once my grandmother told me, I asked my grandmother, right, like, are we, were our ancestors slaves? And she was like, oh, just a few of them, right? Like, when you think about how we existed in America, like, there's a really short period of our ancestors who were enslaved. But my grandmother said something more interesting. She was like, but I never want to be defined by what some white people did to me. Right. When
Wow.
you think about that, right? Like our heritage and our lineage goes, way back. It goes to the islands, it goes to Africa, it goes back generations since the beginning of time and the beginning of culture and the beginning of civilizations.
Mm.
And like, even when we define ourselves by a brief period of history of something white people did, it's kind of reductive and kind of eliminates so much of what we contributed to the world, right? Like, the way we understand astronomy and science and geometry and geography existed before the concept of Black people, existed before enslavement.
Wow.
So that history, when you just define yourself and limit your history to like enslavement, it eliminates all of that stuff that we gave to the world.
Mm. And to me, that feels like one of the most disempowered positions to be in, right? This idea, and the way your grandma, I feel like all of us should be sitting at the knee of Michael Harriot's grandmama. But I feel like your grandmama's wisdom is wisdom that that's the part of that's the point of being a wise elder, right? And this idea that some of them were enslaved. The overwhelming, vast, exponentially greater number of our ancestors were not enslaved Africans, either in this land, in the Carolinas, in the Caribbean, in Latin America. And I think that sometimes we forget, and this is definitely an Americanism. I've seen it a lot in my experiences as being a Black person in this country. We are very comfortable acknowledging our enslaved ancestors. It's as if those were the only ancestors we actually descended from, without recalling that, as your grandmother rightly understood, the vast majority of them were not. And when we're only tapping into, whether it's pouring libation, whether it is having conversation about what we have accomplished, and then I think it was John Henry Clark who talked about the fact that if your history started on a slave ship, everything that come after that, baby, we chilling. This is really, really good. But when your history encompasses Nzinga, which is also a form of resistance, when your history encompasses the creation of math and science, when your history encompasses the ability to see black holes in the sky hundreds of years before Europeans with their tools and their metallic instruments are able to do that, when we don't tap into that element of our ancestry, it feels to me, I'm going to defer to you and your grandmama, but it feels to me like we are essentially cutting ourselves off from one of the greatest sources of power that we actually have, for the sake of being defined once again by what white people have done to us, and in ways that make white people fit neatly into this historical history. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. And then, I would add to that even during that brief period of enslavement, it's kind of a disservice to them, because during that brief period of enslavement, all they did was try to end that brief period of enslavement. They knew, all of those generations knew, this ain't who we are, and we're going to fight to end it. And to define oneself by the thing that they didn't see themselves as is kind of reductive to me.
Yeah. Yeah. And so that, you just stepped on a whole lot of toes. We just waltzed across a whole lot of people's toes. Actually, I think, no, we backed it on up across a whole bunch of people's toes, because there are a lot of folks right now who have claimed an identity that is very in that reductive space. And that identity drives how they move. It drives how they operate. And it drives a lot of division in community in ways that I think are pretty detrimental. And again, encourage us to cut ourselves off from one of the greatest sources of power that we've ever known. But the mental, and I know I brought you here to talk about Project 2025, and I eventually want to get to that, but this to me feels like it's more important at this particular moment. But the idea of reclaiming our mental freedom, to me, also incorporates breaking out of some of the patterns and the habits that we have adopted as survival skills to navigate this awfulness of known as colonization and enslavement in America. And there, Dr. Joy DeGruy talks a lot about DeGruy, sorry. She formerly Lurie, now DeGruy. She talks a lot about the idea that we have to reclaim the mental freedom, because when we don't, we are sort of primed to have as our default language a post-traumatic slave reality. And that requires of us to embrace the same sorts of survival skills that we may have had to incorporate to navigate the plantation. Not that there was wrong on the plantation, but holding on to survival skills that allowed you to navigate the plantation. But what you need right now are the survival skills that are going to help you to create free spaces for African people in the midst of all that we're dealing with. Might not necessarily be the same skill set. There might be some overlap, may not necessarily be the same skill set. And I want to use this moment to sort of pivot to talk about what's happening politically. We're in a moment right now, Michael Harriot, New York Times bestselling author, and just super dope all around storyteller. We're in a moment right now where we are being called to either envision a better world that we can live in, or we're going to play games as usual. And what I mean by that is the following. I've been on a number of calls, Brother Michael, and these calls have been a whole lot of people with money, way more money than I got. I literally work for a city university. I'm not one of them high paid people, literally on the phone with people who got way more money than I could even imagine. And power people who have elected positions, but those who are trying to work within the political realm, and just good Black people trying to do good things. And one of the things I keep hearing on these calls is, you got to make some demands. And the demands that people keep offering, between you and me, ain't nobody listening. It's just me and you, brother. Just me and you. The demands that we keep offering are kind of bullshit demands. They're easy things. They're things that other communities would not ask for, because other communities are accustomed to reaching for the stars and at least landing on the moon. And there is almost an enslaved approach to thinking about freedom that I think keeps us trapped in some ways from even imagining what might be. And I'll just give an example. There was a conversation with some inside folks who were saying, your community does great at excitement and energy, and by your they meant Black, but y'all don't ask for nothing. You like during the Obama administration, everybody was just happy to do the electric slide with Black Camelot, but anybody was really asking for things in concrete ways. And it feels in some ways that our experiences as having been enslaved in this country, as having been primed to always center white people and make them feel comfortable, has also limited our ability to imagine what freedom could look like with or without their permission. Am I making any sense? This is something I've been mulling over for several weeks now, and I need to talk this point out.
Yeah. Like, so I agree with you because many of our demands accept the notion that like this government, this land, this country is going to be racist. And what we are asking is some abrogation from the racist stuff that it will always exist, right? Like when we talk about, for instance, police brutality and say, well, we want all the police officers to have body cams so we can catch them killing us. Like they're gonna kill us. We saying we just want to catch them. We want y'all to see them killing us.
What we see.
Right. And not
Right.
for a fair justice system where, like everyone else in this country, if you kill someone, you know you're going to jail. Right.
Mm.
And so we're asking for like a little bit of evidence so we can fight in a justice system that we automatically concede is going to be biased against us and for the police officers, right? And that is limited imagination, right? Like the imagination should be all like, for instance, police officers, we grant them with authority, we grant them with gun, they can go anywhere, do anything. If they kill someone, whoever it is, Black, white, or whatever, they should, like, that responsibility should come with the acceptance of, if you make a mistake, the punishment is going to be harsher. All of them should get life in prison.
Right.
If they make a mistake, because we've granted them special authority, right? But our imagination says we just want some evidence, right? We just want to see what they did. We just want to show what they did. And I think, like, in many ways, that evidence, like, when we talk about, whether it is reparations or the right to vote, we limit ourselves in how we even consider ourselves as full citizens of this country, right? And I think that is part of the post-traumatic slave syndrome that a lot of us are affected with.
Yeah. How do we free from that? Like it's easy for me to think, all right, I'm on a plantation. This is physical land. I want to get off this plantation. I know if I have a map or if I can read the stars or read the riverways, a la, Harriet Tubman, then I know that physically I want to be, my goal is to get off this land. I don't know what's in freedom, but I know I don't want to be here. It's a physical marker. It's a depiction. It's something that we can tangibly understand and see. The idea of being free in our minds, the idea of releasing the mental hold that internalized white supremacy has on us, that to me feels like a much more challenging area that we often don't necessarily have the tools to delve into. What does that pathway off the mental plantation look like? Because I don't know that we can survive another 4 to 8 years of Black people just being hyped and excited and dancing at the White House. Like I said, I'm not mad at Black Camelot. I get it. I understand it. But it feels to me like we have an opportunity to really be audacious, but it's going to require us to relinquish some of the enslaved mentalities that we are holding on to, even as it pertains to what we deserve as human beings who have an equal, if not greater, obligation and right to be on this earth as we are the grandparents of humanity. What does that process to mental freedom look like?
I think it involves two things. One is, and it sounds theoretical, right? But the understanding of our history and who we are as people, right?
Yeah.
And that necessarily includes the understanding that all of the stuff, because I think part of it is we don't understand that all of the stuff that we see that we want, we gave that to them, right? Like when we're talking about, for instance, affirmative action and, equal schools and taking CRT out of schools and how we don't understand that this whole American education system was created by Black people. It did not exist before the Black people of America, like Black Americans in 1868 and right after the Civil War created the idea of free universal public education. It did not exist until we gave it to America. Right. And
Now,
so
Michael,
when you
I've had callers who called in and said, well, there was a white man who wanted to help free some of the blacks, and he put together the first version of public school. So are you sure about this, historian Michael Harriot? Do you have actual facts to back this? Sorry,
so
I'm
in
looking at your Black AF
1868,
shirt.
the majority Black constitutional delegation of South Carolina went into a room on King Street in Charleston, South Carolina. Now you have to remember that after the Civil War, right, like those states were technically not part of the United States. So to get essentially accepted back into the United States, they had to create a new constitution. Well, South Carolina's constitution did something that no constitution had ever done before. It guaranteed free public education that was publicly funded. It split the state up into school districts. It put a superintendent of education on the executive level. That had never been done before. Wow. The only state, Massachusetts, had passed a law that guaranteed citizens public education, but it wasn't in their constitution. And every now and then they would do what they call a driving out, where when it was too many Black people in the community, they would just drive them out. Well, South Carolina guaranteed that for every person in the state. I mean, in this entire state, right? And it was publicly funded. They had they had more stuff like, they had universal male suffrage. All of those ideas were created by Black people, right? And then they were adopted in other states. And so now we understand that like education is a universal right because Black people gave it to you, right? Like when we talk about America as a Christian nation, right? We understand that the reason we say that is nothing about God or Jesus in the Constitution, but the people who who wrote that Constitution, by and large, as far as we know, were Christians or call themselves Christians, right? So why don't we call the entire American economy a Black economy, right? Like this country could not have existed without the free labor that Black people gave. It is a Black economy, right? So all of the economic progress, like it is incredible to think about a country that started in 1776 in less than 50 years was the most powerful, most economically advanced country on the face of the planet because of Black people's labor and intellectual property, right? And not, again, this country, the white people who came here starved to death and ate leather belts and each other until we showed them how to farm, right? Like all of the ironworks that we see was something that Black people gave to this country, right? Like all of the American technology is Black technology, right? Wow. And so when we understand that, we understand that we're not asking them to give us anything. We already gave this stuff to this country. We just want our stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And I think the second part of that equation, aside from, knowing who we are, part of it is having the audacity to believe that we are like equal and full human beings. And that starts with demanding not just equal treatment, they're just universal human rights, like to understand that your country wrong. Like we have to admit that a lot of the stuff that our country does is wrong and that we are the ones who can change that. And I think those are the two things that free us from the mentality of like we're asking for things instead of trying to get our stuff.
And that to me is the very important part of this moment, because as we're talking about, because I've been doing a lot of Project 2025 and I keep calling it 5 minutes of Project 2025. Brother Michael, ain't been one day that I've been able to do Project 2025 discussion in under 10, 15 minutes. Like, ain't been one day. And I do it on live because I want people who aren't listening to Sirius to also be able to get it. But I struggle with it because I'm spending so much time talking about Project 2025 that I feel like I need to spend greater amount of time talking about what Project Freedom looks like. And it's challenging. It's I've found, even for me, it is more challenging to talk about what Project Freedom looks like, because I too am accustomed to reacting to agendas that other people who benefit from our oppression have put out there, as opposed to having the free mental space, the reclaimed freedom mental space, to be able to envision what this country actually could do, what it actually could be, which is one of the reasons why I'm kind of stoked about this whole everything that's happening with the election. Like, I mean, at the end of the day, it's what it is. But it feels good to have hope. And I feel like if we can continue down that vein, it's going to be important. Well, let me say it this way. It's going to be necessary for us to continue down this vein, because I can't have it be. And I see someone on Twitter said, well, it wasn't Obama's fault. He ain't do nothing for us. We ain't ask him. Exactly. That's the point. I need us to do what Denzel Washington tells Nate Parker in the film Great Debaters, to find and reclaim our righteous minds, Michael Harriot, so that we are going to be able to create the freedom loving communities and the freedom manifesting communities that we deserve, even while we're living in the midst of Babylon, as my uncle would say. So that to me is important. And I thank you for helping me to tease that out. But I do, in just the moment that we have left, I do need to ask you about Project 2025. That is technically why we brought you here. I wanted to get some of your thoughts about this. We have this master plan, a master plan. I don't know how master we want to call it, but it's this major plan that the right wing has sort of just written down what they were already doing, but it's the physical written embodiment of their vision for the future. And it's, as you know, it's in depth, it's it's organized in a variety of ways, that they're very methodical, extraordinarily granular. And that, to me, as evil as it is, sometimes I have said, you ever see something so evil that you like, damn, that's impressive. Like, you wasn't just evil, you was evil. Like, that was impressively evil. And I'm wondering how we get to, and again, this is, I guess, a continuation of the previous question, how do we get to a space where producing something of that magnitude, I ain't saying it's got to be 900 pages, it could be, 9,000 verses of a rap song, I don't know, but like producing something like that we can hold on to as our vision for what Project Freedom looks like for us. Give us a sense as to your understanding of the steps, in addition to learning our history, knowing who we are, understanding the reality of what we're dealing with. How far off are we from being able to manifest something like that for ourselves? And do you have any insight into what would be good or advisable for us to do to bring us a little bit closer? Because it feels like we can talk a lot about Project 2025, but I don't get as much insight or even caller interaction when I'm asking people what it is that they would want to see in a Project Freedom.
Well, one of the reasons, again, like going back to my previous comment about history, right? One of the things that, like, I hear this comment in many different ways, like, where's the Black agenda? When are we going to get a Black agenda? We need something that's detailed, because people don't understand that we have already created that a bunch of times, right? Like in 1979, like every Black political leader came together in Indianapolis, Indiana, and created a Black political agenda. And since then, we've seen like Tavis Smiley write a book about it. We've seen books. We've seen
He used to do the conferences every
NAACP,
year.
the,
Yes.
Urban League. We've seen economists put together. And what they always end up with is a version of the same thing we did in 1979, because we always know what we wanted, right? Like, it might be like, in 1979, right? They said, like, we need to address mass media, right? So like the updated version also includes the internet, but it's a version of the same thing that we've always had. So we've always had a Black agenda, right? And like this Project 2025 is essentially the white agenda, right? It just correlates all of these disparate ideas and put it under one document and said, how do we achieve that? And then, like you said, they go into granular details. But like, I think, again, the inherent subjugation of ourselves makes us believe like we don't have no Black agenda, when there is one. You can look it up, you can pull it up, you can get it in PDF form, you can get it in book form, you can get it on an audio book. Like, all of it exists, right? And the idea, because it's a crazy idea that, I mean, just think about the inherent insanity of thinking that Black people have been fighting for all of these years, and all of these ideas we agree upon, we just never wrote it down. Like, that's crazy for people to believe, right? That's the idea of, I am a descendant of what white people did to me.
Wow.
Right? right? That's a product of it,
Wow.
right? That's what you
So,
get when
but
you.
here's a let me just ask this though, because I'm not a man, the clock trying to run out real quick. But if that's the case, and we have this plan, and it is the case, because I know it is to be true, where is the stick to itiveness, as my mother would call it, that allows us to work out that plan? Because we having a plan is one thing, working it out and manifesting it is very different. And does our plan, as it existed then, or the 2.3.4.0 versions of it today, does it require white consent, permission? Does it require white people to play any role at all, or is this a plan that we could accomplish on our own?
Well, it is both things, right? Like there are some things that even a grassroots organization or we as a people cannot do. Like there's a reason you pay taxes, because there's some things that are
Right.
the government's responsibility. Like you bought that stuff that you want, right? Like it's not the government conceding it to you. Bought it, you paid for it, right? And just like the idea of we like that trickle down economics theory, right? Like if you put money in at the top, it'll trickle down to the poor, right? We already paid for all of the stuff that we want. We paid double, triple sometimes, right? Like there is data that shows, like for instance, Black people pay higher taxes per when you do it by income than white people who pay that. So we already pay for all of the stuff that we want, right? We have to, and then the first part of it is not just we like some people like to say like, well, why is the solution always voting? Because you got to get have the first step. Like there's always a step one, right? You get the people in
Right.
office, and then you demand that the people in office do what you want them to do, and then you got to recognize when they're doing what you want to do. Here's an example, because I want to relate it to Project 2025, right? So when people who say Obama never did anything, right? So that government data shows that schools discipline children, Black children, more harshly than white children who commit the same offense. So in 2012, Obama's Department of Education, the Civil Rights Department in that Department of Education, wrote what we call a Dear Colleague letter that basically said, essentially, we know what y'all doing. We see y'all. If y'all keep doing it, we gonna sue you. And all of a sudden, all across the country, right, schools started figuring out alternatives to just kicking kids out of school, right?
Yep.
Like magic. It was like all of a sudden it happened. Well, Project 2025, that was based on a principle called Disparate Impact, which says that you don't have to be use the N-word or intentionally racist for something to be racist. If it impacts Black people negatively or a protected group negatively versus white people, then it is racist on its face. Well, Project 2025 says we are going to eliminate the disparate impact concept
That's
from
right.
the entire federal government. And if we catch you using that concept, it's grounds for termination, right? So we might not see some of those
Right.
things that elected officials did for us, right? But it happens, right? I remember when there was this big hullabaloo about this stack of bills that were going to be passed. Well, in one of those, one of them was a Obama administration policy that wanted to hire 100,000 more cops across the country. And the Congressional Black Caucus says, now we're not going to vote on any of these bills if that's included in them. And it suddenly disappeared. Now, people didn't see it. It didn't make any news, but that is the result of us electing who we want and having them represent us, right? So those are the things that we have to realize that are part of step one in this plan.
I love that. I love that. This is, brother, I hope we can get you to come on the show more, because I feel like you help tease out things that are really important, that is so easy for us to miss, but actually help bring together so many things. And today it just started with your grandmama saying some of them was, but I will not define myself by something that some white folks did to me. I think that those are bars. Those are what we call bars. What's the best way for people to connect with you between now and the next time we can get you back on air?
I am on all social media as Michael Harriot, MichaelHarriot, and I write a column for the Griot Weekly.